We believe it will provide a springboard for coordination across sectors and across institutions for the sustainable growth of this city in the future. And we believe that the lessons learned here in Kolkata and the insights gained here in Kolkata can be shared with other cities across India, perhaps even beyond India, to help them in their sustainability agendas. And I think this is particularly important at a time when India is planning to come up with 100 smart cities. And it could be that those cities in their development can learn lessons from the great city of Kolkata. Now, transition and change is never an easy thing. So working together will be absolutely critical. There will be barriers, there will be challenging times. What we need is the right political vision, the right leadership. We need collective wisdom. And with those things, we can work together to do the right thing, to create not just one smart city, but perhaps 100 more. Now, looking around this room, I'm confident that we have here much of that vision, much of that leadership, and a huge amount of collective wisdom. If we can bring some of that to bear over the next few days, we'll be making a very important step on our journey. I wish you all a very successful and productive conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wood. Particularly for, dwelling on the UK initiative to make Kolkata a low-carbon city. The various interventions in the area of planning and design of physical and social infrastructure, water resources, solid waste management, disaster management plan, green growth, that were very nicely elucidated by you. Maybe this will be a step towards making Kolkata a little similar to London, as we keep talking all the time. I believe there's a Kolkata eye also in the vision, like the famous London eye. Okay. Dr. Pradipta Ghosh, a graduate in chemical engineering from IIT Delhi, and then a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University in the US. Dr. Ghosh is a distinguished fellow and director at TERI. He's concurrently the member of the PM's Council on Climate Change and the G20 Advisory Group of the Ministry of Finance. And as we all know, he retired as Secretary, Ministry of Environment and Forests, Government of India, when he retired from the IAS in 2007. Dr. Ghosh, please.
हाँ, but my presentation वहाँ पे लोड किया था, यहाँ पे नहीं आएगा ना? Will it come here? Yes, sir. My presentation, because it's there, but it's not coming here.
You would like to make the presentation from here? I'll just change the laptop.
Okay, I have
change the laptop.
No, I have got my own laptop, so we can
change the laptop.
So let me begin by thanking the BCCI for inviting me to this very important annual event. The theme of my presentation is Equity in Environmental Sustainability and Climate Change. And what I would like to do in this presentation is give all of you a flavor of the international academic and political debate around the question of equity with respect to global environmental resources, but in particular with respect to climate change. Now, why is, next please. Why is equity so important? And let me illustrate this by referring to what, next please, what the costs of GHG mitigation for India would be. And this is the results of certain formal models which have been developed in India, and we have the published results of these models. Next, please. Next. Next. Now, this first slide gives the undiscounted incremental energy system cost for CO2 reductions from what we may loosely call as the business as usual scenario from 2011 to 2031. And these are all published results which are available on the MOEF website. And it shows that for a 30% reduction, the undiscounted energy system cost over this period, over this 20-year period, would be more than $1 trillion US. Next, please. And if we look at, from a different model, if we look at the overall economic impacts, that is the impacts on GDP, for imposing various levels of carbon tax over the same period, then we come to a staggering figure of more than $4 trillion of economic losses at an $80 per ton carbon tax. So obviously the question of who gets to pay for GHG mitigation and what the respective responsibilities of countries are is an extremely important question in the international policy debate. Next, please. So now let me turn to the major theme of my presentation. The first is intergenerational equity, and this is mostly a recap of the seminal Stern review. Next, please. Now, the question of impacts of sustainability or climate change on future generations and other nations raise very firmly the questions of rights. Protection from harm done by others lies at the heart of many philosophical approaches to liberty, freedom and justice. And protection from harm is also expressed in many legal structures around the world in terms of legal responsibility for damage to the property or well-being of others. And many would argue that future generations have the right to enjoy a world whose climate has not been transformed in a way that makes human life much more difficult. And the concept related to the idea of rights of future generations is that of sustainable development, that future generations should have a right to a standard of living no lower than the current one. Next, please. This principle need not imply that the whole environment and natural resource endowment of resources, whole natural environment and endowment of resources should be preserved by this generation for the next generation in a form exactly as received from the previous generation. On the other hand, it seems quite clear that at a basic level, the global environmental and ecological system, which provides us with life support functions such as stable and tolerable climatic conditions, cannot be substituted. And in this approach, each generation has the responsibility of stewardship, and some would see climate in this way since it shapes so much of the natural environment and is not straightforwardly substitutable with other capital. So, to cut a long story short, next please, next. So Stern essentially said that if a future generation is present, and he had some caveats about that, we suppose that it has the same claim on our ethical attention as the current one. And then he came to this conclusion that he arrived at a very low intergenerational discount rate, and this drives his conclusion that the value of future climate change impacts is very high in relation to future GDP, and he comes up with a number of some 20% of GDP. Next, please. Now let's look at historical responsibility for climate change. And this is research done by Terry, and this shows the historical responsibility for climate change among the G20 members. There's no data for Argentina, so therefore Argentina is not represented. But if you look at the historical emissions per capita from 1850 to 2011, then we find that India is actually the lowest, and in fact much lower than the next country, which is Indonesia, out of all the countries in the G20. The US has the highest per capita historical responsibility, the UK has the second, Germany the third, and so on. And if we look at GHG emissions per capita among G20 members, then we find that once again India has the lowest per capita emissions among all the G20 members. And then another aspect of the climate change story is the emissions intensity per dollar of GDP in purchasing power parity terms. And here we find that India is sandwiched somewhere between Japan and the United States. So even in terms of emissions intensity of the GDP, India is not doing at all badly in relation to its G20 peers. Now let's look at what the UNFCCC has to say. And it essentially lays down two issues. One is it affirms that the largest share of historical and current emissions are due to developed countries, and it also lays down the fundamental principle driving all the climate change negotiations, which is that while all countries are expected to contribute to protection of the global environment, but this must be done on the basis of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability. And the entire international debate is on equity and climate change, is essentially about an agreed detailing and clear means of operationalizing this CBDR principle. So when it comes to emissions, what are the ways in which the different aspects of responsibility can be assigned? One indicator is the cumulative emissions or temperature rise. A second is when do we start counting? A third is which sectors and gases do we count? And the fourth is let's not forget about the past and let's look at future emissions. And there's a huge north-south divide on the different elements of the calculation choices. For example, on questions of cumulative emissions or temperature change, the north says that temperature change is what drives climate change, not emissions per se. And the south responds that there is a lot of scientific uncertainty of linkage between GHG concentrations and temperature change, and earlier emissions count for less than later emissions, and this distinction is iniquitous. On the question of start date, the north affirms that countries were innocent of the knowledge that GHG emissions would cause climate change till recently, and so they cannot be held to account for cumulative emissions, say, prior to 1990. And the south says that scientific knowledge of climate change was available in the 19th century, and in any event, prior knowledge of likely harm from an action or intent to cause harm is relevant in the arena of criminal liability, but we are not in that arena, but that of determination of historical responsibility. And civil liability laws typically consider the consequences of harmful actions and not the intent behind them. Next, please. I think we just have to, yeah. Please go on. Please continue. Next, please. Next. No. Just go back. Just go back. Just go, yeah, this set. Sectors and gases. Now, when it comes to sectors and gases, the north says that we count gases and sectors depending on reliability of the data, and for the south, this would leave out CO2 from deforestation for earlier periods when major deforestation occurred in the north, but would include it for later periods when it's happening primarily in the south, and this creates an ad hoc asymmetry between north and south. Now, I will skip a number of slides because of the time constraint, and they are available for those of you who have an interest in pursuing this issue. But suffice it to say, can we go to slide number 30, please? Next, please. Yeah, listen. So now let's turn to the question of intragenerational equity. And here there are several approaches. One is contraction and convergence. This is by Aubrey Meyer, and his approach is that since the world's atmosphere belongs equally to everyone, if it belongs to anyone at all, the only basis on which such an agreement seems possible is that there must eventually at least be an equal allocation to everyone in the world. Next, please. Next, please. And this picture shows what the Aubrey Meyer's allocation would do, and clearly it would show that if we look at the emissions trajectory up to 2010, the yellow line gives, the yellow band gives what India's emissions allocations would be, and the rest of the world is the pink one, and is the grey one on top, and the rest of the OECD is this pink one. China is the light blue one. So clearly it shows that, India would be in fact entitled to a significant increase in its emissions profile going up to around 2020. Next, please. However, developing countries have critiqued contraction and convergence because it does not take historical responsibility into account, and therefore responsibility for the accumulated emissions are forgiven. Next, please. And Stern had a critique of equal per capita. Essentially, he said that rights are of great importance in ethics, but that they should be argued rather than merely asserted. Next, please. And developing countries, they have responded to Stern's critique. They say it is not true that formal defense of equal per capita does not exist in the published literature, and Stern has in fact neglected such literature. And moreover, Stern himself has simply asserted and not argued for welfare maximization as the appropriate ethical norm for intergenerational equity. And an application of Stern's own formulation to the dimension of intragenerational equity would lead to conclusions very different from what Stern himself advocates for intergenerational allocation of resources. So now let's look at, next please. Next. So now let's look at a presentation which was made on behalf of India to the UNFCCC. This was made by myself in 2012. But I must clarify that this is not at this point in time India's official position. Next please. And what this presentation says is that the terrain of equity is much more complex than simply intergenerational and intragenerational equity. It certainly relates to securing the right interest and involvement of future generations. It looks at obligations of parties in relation to GHG mitigation. It looks at obligations of parties in relation to adaptation. It looks at obligations of parties with respect to loss of livelihoods due to GHG mitigation by others. It looks at obligations and entitlements of parties with respect to finances and technology transfer. And also it asserts that climate change obligations need to be realized on the basis of equity if the arrangements are to have wide political acceptability and hence sustainability in practice. Next please. And what this presentation essentially does, it sets out 6 propositions and it then provides a formal justification for these propositions responding to Nick Stern's challenge. Next please. And these are 6 propositions. I will not read them out in the interest of time management, but they cover the entire terrain of equity that I have just set forth. The final proposition 6 is actually the equal per capita principle. It says all human beings have equal entitlements to global environmental resources. The question of historical responsibility comes in from the following sentence. It says each person is the legatee of her parents and carries their undischarged obligations as well as their unused entitlements. They may exchange these entitlements and obligations by mutual prior informed consent, and these entitlements and obligations in the aggregate are limited by the ultimate objective of the Climate Change Convention. And there's a methodology, and I will again not present the details of the methodology. And the final approach that I would cite is the greenhouse development rights from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And what it says is that the overall perspective is that an emergency climate stabilization program is needed, that such a program is only possible if the international effort sharing impasse is decisively broken, and this impasse arises from a severe but nevertheless surmountable conflict between the climate crisis and the development crisis. It also addresses the concern in the north that the rich in the south should also share the burden of GHG mitigation. And this, next please. Please go to slide number 44. So this is the Stockholm Environmental Institute's global development rights, the empirical results of that. And the red line gives the 2 degrees centigrade emergency pathway. The green line says what the non-Annex 1 or developing countries, what their entitlement would be up to 2050. The blue one says what the Annex 1 emissions would be up to 2050. And this slide, actually the next slide, 45, it gives the specific basis on which the GDR has been formulated. And slide number 46 shows what the allocations would be for India, China and the US. The green is actually they represent the national incomes of above the $20 level, and so the excluded income, which actually is not counted towards the allocation rights, is given in yellow. And the next slide, slide 47, gives the definitions of capability and responsibility which the Stockholm Environment Institute has set forth. But there are critiques of this greenhouse development rights. The first criticism, next please, this is slide 48. It relies on internal income distribution of countries for determination of capability, and this is difficult to justify as it penalizes more equitable societies at the cost of the less equitable, for example, Japan versus the US. It does not address historical responsibility, and it is empirically problematic in that internal distributions of income are taken into account, which are essentially a matter for the sovereign responsibilities of countries, and it also relies on purchasing power parity, which is not wholly objective. The last slide gives the references on which this presentation has been based, and I see some students here, and some of them may like to pursue this topic in greater detail. For that, they can download the full presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Ghosh, this was a wonderfully illustrated presentation on various aspects and costs of GHG mitigation, the impact of the carbon tax, and various kind of intergenerational equities, intragenerational equities, social discount rates, and I hope all those equities so beautifully presented has negated the slight inequity of our presentation aids. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. Our next speaker this morning is Mr. Siddharth Mehta, who graduated from the very prestigious Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Then he spent a major part of his career with Tata Power for 24 years, and also championed the growth of Essar Power and Torrent Power, and is presently the Chief Executive Officer of India Power Corporation Limited. Mr. Mehta, please.
Good morning. Mr. Roy, thank you first for inviting me. Mr. Bhattacharya, Mr. Scott, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and consumers of electricity. More importantly, we are all first the consumer of electricity before anything else. Yesterday, I was reading in the newspaper in the Times of India, and I was with the Energy Secretary of Government of Maharashtra, and we had an extensive discussion. And I asked him, where are we with respect to the power sector in India? We had a very fruitful discussion, and he said, 2 words he told me. We are in a mess. What are the issues today grappling the power sector? Let us first understand before we talk about future, we talk about sustainability, we talk about many other aspects. But let us first understand the reality which is existing today. 218 coal blocks are turned illegal. Supreme Court, whatever it decides. What is the impact of that? I'll come first with the fuel supplies. What is the impact of that? The impact is lenders have lent 770,000 crores of rupees to the sector. Way back in 1999, when the coal blocks were being allotted, people were told to take the coal blocks, saying that you can use this coal, you can generate, take this, please generate more power. That was the era. Lenders made so much of investment. Out of that, power sector is 5,800,000 crores lending to the power sector itself. Bleeding discoms. non-availability of power. Maharashtra today has 4,000 megawatt of shortage during the Ganesh festival. Headlines. We have first to address our own house which is burning today. These are the major burning issues. I will dwell which each of the sectors in the power sector and what are the issues which each one is facing. Therefore, as far as the coal is concerned, what is required in the coal sector? Efficiency of operations. Today, just 5% reduction in the efficiency of operations in the last quarter has resulted in reduction of 2,000 megawatt of coal generation base not available. Second, there is a coal linkage. Because of the coal linkage, the plants are running. Are they running efficiently? Are the heat rates proper? Do you have a right plant load factor? There are new plants which are coming up which are to be run efficiently and coal is not getting allocated. Please look at the resource that is available and look at the efficiency of operations for these resources. Both have to go together in hand. Third, as far as the coal is concerned, please bring in new technologies. India has much more production capacity than compared to Indonesia, has more reserves. We are not able to increase this capacity due to non-availability of technology. And operate this efficiently so that you can take care of the climate. We are a growing economy. Base load power is only going to come either from thermal or from nuclear. Nuclear is not possible in present environment. And therefore thermal is the only alternative that we have got. 82% of our generation is base thermal. So the efficiency of operation as far as the coal sector is concerned is today the most burning and the most critical issues. And allocating coal to new projects which are coming up, investments have been made, people are waiting, they are the most efficient running units are there, must be done very quickly. The second aspect is the generation. The right mix of generation. Coal is available in one area. This coal getting transported from one area to the other area which is far off, and that coal on that area gets transported to the other area. Why can't we decentralize, we ensure that the coal where the load centers are there gets allocated? The generating companies are facing quality problems. You see any generating plant, there are stones. Ash contents very high. Who pays? The consumer. Who pays for this? The consumer. Quality of coal, efficiency of operation, and a right mix of generation. Second, look at the transmission. In the transmission sector, we have added 50% of generation.